Well, today we've got real life succession drama, a health check on the U.S. economy, a look at two of the advertiser categories currently dealing with actions from the U.S. administration, auto and pharma. And lastly, a look ahead at what life for marketers might look like in 2030. Welcome to episode 75 of the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. I'm Kate Scott-Dawkins, joined by Jeff Foster. And each week, we analyze the latest economic news, financial results, and industry developments from the world's largest buyers and sellers of advertising and explain what they mean for brands. So let's jump in. Jeff, how was your week? How was your weekend?
No, it's been good. Great weekend, huge sports weekend. So that was so much fun with the U.S. Open here in New York was great. Obviously, the start of football season, baseball season coming down to the playoff race. So it's been a lot of fun. And then this week's been off to an incredibly busy start.
Yeah, the SF Giants have been very up and down this year. I've tried to keep up with the games as much as possible, but I think we're still in the wild card race.
He's still in the race, yeah.
All right, well, let's chat about news from the U.S. economy first. We had data this week on CPI inflation from the U.S. that came in at 2.9 in August, so up from the previous reading. And there was news about the jobs numbers being revised downward substantially, 911,000 in the year through March 2025, and those really starting within 2024 in the previous administration. So we had been sort of feeling this divergence between what the data was telling us and maybe what it felt like to consumers on the ground. Do you think this brings us more into alignment?
Yeah, it definitely seems like that because just, purely anecdotal, just using the eyeball test, obviously very small sample size, but talking to friends and colleagues, it definitely felt like the job market was a lot worse than some of the numbers may have been showing, and kind of that with the economy in general. Again, New York is a little bit of a microcosm, but just, prices have just been out of control on food prices, just grocery staples and everything from dining out. Again, I think this kind of gels with what is sort of the sentiment that you're seeing, because it did seem like there was like a really big disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. And we at times had been kind of scratching our heads in this podcast earlier in the year saying, well, labor market's still strong, so we're not going to see rate cuts. I think now the expectations are certainly for the Fed to make, at least a quarter point rate cut in September, which again, for advertisers, that means maybe consumers have an easier time with auto loans, slightly lower auto loan rates. Maybe businesses are a little bit more likely to invest and take on credit there. So could be a positive unless we get to this kind of stagflation world where I'm not sure that's our base case right now for the U.S. in our forecast, but it's a word that is coming up more and more often, I think, in the economic press.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I really do think we're lined up for the Fed to cut a little bit. That sure seems like we're heading in that direction. But yeah, I think, we still have a few more data points to come in that will definitely, sway them one way or another.
Well, also, speaking of sectors that are sensitive to both the economy and regulation, there was news this week about potential new restrictions on pharmaceutical advertising and its impact on the U.S. ad market. You and I spent quite a bit of time yesterday looking at this for WP Media and our clients. What's the quick net for you on everything we looked at?
Yeah, well, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. We're obviously in the early stages here, but the pharma industry is quite large. Here in the U.S., we're looking at about 16.4 billion in 2024. So it's a good chunk, and it's a lot of considerable advertising. And if these restrictions and regulations go into place, we might have an environment that was probably more similar to, I guess, 1996 was the last time that there are these types of regulations on pharmaceutical advertisers. So, if that happens, it could definitely make a substantial impact on the industry. But there's still a lot to be hammered out.
That's exactly it, right? Congress is likely to weigh in. The courts are likely to weigh in with legal challenges to this. Nothing is seemingly set in stone here, and I think there are going to be considerations. And large pharmaceutical companies already do a lot in the world of disclosures and disclaimers and making sure that their advertisements fall within the letter of the current law. So something we're going to definitely keep an eye on. Pharma in particular particular has a larger share of the US advertising industry than a lot of other markets where farm advertising is more restricted. So maybe we see, the US come more in line with some of those other markets, but at the moment anything like a wholesale ban looks exceedingly unlikely still.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and it's been interesting to look at the some of the spend data from Guideline SMI, and just really watching the drift towards digital spending in the pharma category as well, which is now about 60% share is what the data is showing, which was quite a considerable jump over the last about 7 years, where it was a little bit more television centric. So it would be really interesting to see these, what these impacts are. But again, there's still a lot that needs to be determined by Congress, by legislation, by the courts.
Yeah, but certainly, we're looking at linear TV, like you said, and some social and digital advertising as being sort of the places of impact, and increasingly
Yeah,
streaming TV because they've been expanding outside of linear TV for some years already.
exactly.
All right, well, moving from pharma to media, the Murdoch family finally reached a deal on the future of Fox and News Corp. Were you keeping track of all this Nevada probate court news over the last few months?
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely been an interesting topic. So it came as, I guess, a little bit of a surprise that it was the news was announced. What was it, late on Monday? So it kind of came out of nowhere. There wasn't a lot of chatter that something like this was going to happen, but not surprised. I know they've made some overtures in the past to sort of consolidate all of the power into Lachlan, but I guess from a media standpoint, this, it gives a pretty clear picture of the direction that Fox and News Corp will be heading in. So if there are any questions in the marketplace, if there's going to be a change in editorial direction, the answers have been settled and it's a resounding no. So I think we have a pretty good idea what, what News Corp will look like going forward, as at least to the editorial direction, and the same thing with Fox and especially Fox News. Now, the other interesting thing is Lachlan had a quote that was, "It's great news for investors. It gives us clarity about our strategy going forward, and it shows that our strategy will be consistent." So, I think in the short term, that's what we would expect to see. I guess the question is, does this, raise the opportunity for M&A on the horizon? I think that's the bigger question of what that opens up.
Yeah, you and I have had several conversations. I mean, I think it's more interesting when we don't necessarily agree, when there are so many different possibilities for what could happen here that, we're not sure which one it'll take. But this has been a source of fascinating conversation for this week. There's some kind of a tie-up between Fox and some of the other linear networks, Versant or the WBD spinoff Discovery. I was sort of looking at a possibility where they lean much more heavily into the digital world, Tubi, and some of them maybe like betting or other like heavily
Mhm.
digital sort of areas. So quite different opportunities. I don't know if you've changed where you've ended on.
Anything is a possibility. So, I mean, all options are on the table. But there's been a lot of speculation, especially from some of our friends on the Wall Street side, writing about how there's going to be a couple companies that would love to get their hands on sports assets and entertainment assets, and the value of a broadcast network, especially at the NBCU spinoff and Warner Brother Discovery cable spinoff. So, I think you'll be hearing lots more speculation on that in the future as those deals finalize. I think the Versant spinoff should be done at the end of the year. And now we just heard that the Warner Brothers Discovery should be finalized, I think in March or April, I want to say. So probably around the first quarter of next year. So I think once those deals get finalized and you might have two potential partners for sports entertainment assets, then I think we'll start hearing lots of speculation out there. But, it may happen, it may not, like anything else in life.
Yeah, I was just worried about orphaning, the the Fox News. Even if you combine that with News Corp, you've got two sort of assets that are declining in ad share and
Right.
growth, and at least, I mean, Fox News is doing well for viewership, but linear overall. So I don't know if that is a place where you want to be left holding that holding that
Yeah.
bag.
Yeah, exactly. It does raise a very interesting question, especially when some decisions are maybe business based and some might be a little bit more emotional based. Controlling a news network like Fox News definitely, puts you in a very influential position in politics and culture in the US and around the world. That does have that kind of value. Whether or not that can be measured financially is a completely different question, but it does have value.
Let's finish up with the other sort of news and media piece from this week. You watched the YouTube NFL game in Brazil, right?
Yeah, it was really good. The stream looked incredibly clear, at least on my end, no issues whatsoever. Game looked great. Production value was awesome. And yeah, it was a really good experience. I flipped over to some of the like the influencers that were doing their commentary. So it was kind of fun to see that. Yeah, the viewership numbers looked pretty good. It was over 16 million in the US, and then factoring in worldwide, it was 17.3 million people.
All right. Well, that's the news media world. Plenty for advertisers to be getting busy with and finding places to invest in sports. Shifting gears, literally, to talk about cars because before all the pharma news, I know you were spending a lot of time this week on our auto composite and building that out to increasingly look at more of the Chinese-based companies that are so big in this sector now.
Yeah, so as we're gearing up for our next TYNY report and looking at categories, just doing some of our analysis on the auto sector, and we were looking at some of more of the Chinese OEMs like BYD, NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, and then VinFast from Vietnam, and of course Lucid, the EV startup. And it was really interesting to just see that Lucid has a 6.2% advertising as share of revenue and VinFast 5.6, which is a lot higher than the reported median of 1.9% for the industry in 2024. Yeah, these companies they're spending. Obviously, it's a lower coming off a lower base versus some of the major OEMs like the Toyotas and the GMs and Hyundais of the world. But really interesting to see that they're definitely investing in advertising and marketing.
Yeah, well, new entrants to the market, spending to gain consumer awareness and consideration makes sense. Some following the Tesla model of shopping mall showrooms for sure. I've been into both the Lucid and the VinFast showrooms at our local shopping center within the last year, actually. I don't Have you ever been in any of these sort of newer EV showrooms, Jeff?
No, unfortunately, here in New York, I haven't had the chance to. But there was a Lucid display near me that was a temporary pop up, which was very cool. They did a great job on it.
Yeah, the VinFast one was interesting because you, like, only rented the battery and then you could switch it out when that degraded a bit, I think was the premise, if I'm
Right?
remembering
Yeah.
correctly. But yeah, really interesting, and I think when we're building up the December TYY forecast, we're gonna be looking more at, revenue, unit sales across these different companies and, as much as we can, looking at BYD compared to some of the more legacy players here and what that means for advertisers and the, US European market, all of those basically in terms of competing for a share and what that means for EVs versus ICE vehicles going forward too.
Exactly, and I thought it was pretty interesting when we were looking into Rivian that they do mention advertising, but they mention it as immaterial.
Yeah, so still too small to disclose much there, but we take the data where we can get it. Speaking of the future and what we're looking at in terms of electric vehicles and sort of a new model of transportation, the other things that happened this week was we released our extended cut version of our advertising in 2030 report. This was so much fun to work on. I've referenced it here on the podcast before, but now the sort of version with our direct quotes from the respondents is out. And we asked more than 60 of our clients, partners, and respected peers across the industry to weigh in on what media technology and consumer behavior would look like in 2030. I was just going to pull out a couple of the things here. We'll make sure there's a link to the full report you can download too. One of them is everything is personalized to individuals based on chosen settings, historical data, their sources, maybe even including genetic and medical information. And 61% agreed that would be likely by 2030. I know, you envisioning in your 2030 apartment, Jeff, you have like your toothbrush and your whatever else is in your bathroom, telling like reading your bio signals and sending you ads for what you need to be eating or how you need to be exercising that day?
I don't know if that's fantastic or kind of scary, but it's it definitely opens up some possibilities. I will say, just kind of playing around with AI and asking it for sort of like, workout schedules or suggestions on recovery days. It's really fascinating. You kind of start treating it like your own little friend or advisor. So I can just see as it's getting more and more, ingrained in everyday life, where it's just going to be probably pretty present going forward.
Yeah, the question is what form that takes,
Right.
right? I think that our experts were less optimistic on new forms of computing interaction, right? So they didn't think it was likely that sales of glasses and earbuds would outweigh smartphones by 2030. They thought the phone was going to remain sort of the primary method of interacting. And they also did not think that we asked the question basically, more than 5% of households globally have humanoid robots, and 60% rated it highly unlikely.
Unlikely.
So I don't know. You may be treating it like your personal friend, but definitely not your personal butler yet. Then.
Yeah, exactly. I still think we're a bit ways off, but you can definitely see where it's all heading.
Yeah, like this is, I think, so much fun to just pick your head up from where we're sitting today and try to imagine a future a little bit further out. We do often get into these scenarios, I think, where 5 years feels quite close. And I think a lot of people were quite pessimistic about how quickly we would get to these big technology changes versus things that were more software based. Maybe they thought those would come sooner. But that said, the change we've seen in something like generative AI and creative production has been massive in just 2 years. So it's going to be interesting to see. We'll check back in and see how our experts did in a couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. I did see the announcement that was it OpenAI is looking to make movies now.
I mean, I'll be more excited if they turn public so we get their data.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, look, more competition for good content shouldn't be a bad thing. Comes in all sorts of formats and increasingly probably AI generated characters.
Yeah.
My kids right now are super into K-pop Demon Hunters
Oh yeah.
on Netflix. We've been listening to the soundtrack on repeat, and those are real voice actors, but certainly,
Right.
animated characters. And you could see how the next transition to that is just, fully animated and generated. But that's obviously something that was still a sticking point of the writers and actors strikes a
Yeah.
couple of years ago. So that transition is going to be, closely watched and monitored.
Closely, because I think those contracts, the agreements with the writers and actors is coming up fairly soon. So we'll have a good idea of where this is going.
Have you listened to any of the songs? They're very catchy, I
They
have
are
to say.
catchy. They're really catchy.
All right. What else in the world of sort of buzz this week? Apple's Tech Showcase, which I have to admit I did not watch live. I watched a sort of catch up video, but not not a lot to like get your teeth into there. Colors and
Yeah.
durability specs, but I don't know what did you take away from that?
Yeah, that was, just sort of reading some of the reviews and the write-ups. It was kind of uneventful. It sort of reminds me of, maybe CES or the television industry a bunch of years ago, where it was, at first you get all these splashy announcements about the 100-inch TV and the plasma, and then all of a sudden it's just, very incremental, small improvements. And I feel like we've kind of entered that world. We've probably been there for a bit on the iPhone, just incremental improvements, a little bit of changes on hardware. I think we're sort of in that area until there's the next big thing. Of course, foldable phones is kind of been talked about on the horizon, and maybe that will make an impact. But I think the takeaway from a lot of the reviewers was, if you need to upgrade a phone, it's great, awesome phone. But if you're not on the market, then you hold off. And I think that's sort of the consensus that
Yeah,
we're the
to me, there
world we're
wasn't
in now.
enough about how these things tied. Like they talked about phones and then earbuds and
Right.
then watches, but there's not an overarching element of how it surrounds your life or how they're connected or
Ex-
how AI is driving that. And I think that's Apple's problem in particular,
yeah.
really, which was on display. So probably no immediate upgrade for, for me.
Exactly. I don't
Um,
think those days. I feel like I'm old enough to remember where the lines for me out of the Apple Store, even every year people upgrading on a yearly basis. Yeah, I feel like that feels like it's like ancient history at this point,
yeah, well, my personal phone is a Google Pixel, so
right?
I'm holding
But
holding on to that for now.
yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, sort of covered all the bases on U.S. economy, the cooling signals, the Murdoch family's succession finale. US pharma ad updates, aggressive ad spending in the auto sector from some of those newcomers, and the NFL's streaming surge on YouTube TV, plus a little plug for our 20th advertising forecast, and then what we think is going to happen in the tech industry. So, thanks for joining. Next week will be in person. I'm going to New York. So we'll try to record this one together in New York, talk about the happenings next week. I'm speaking at Moffett-Nathanson Advertising Day. We're seeing a couple clients next week. There should be plenty to talk about in that vein as well. Any other watch outs for you for the week, Jeff?
Yeah, no, this is just the fun time of year with college football, NFL. It's a great sports season, so I'm really looking forward to that on the weekend. And hopefully, we should have some really, really, really nice weather here in New York. So hopefully that stays the same.
Yeah, just for me. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, the Media Intelligence podcast from WPP Media is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. If you have any questions for the show, you can email business.intelligence@wppmedia.com.